Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Allison's Corner. Today, I am joined by a very special guest. Guest, if you can, please introduce yourself to the people.
Hello to all of Allison's listeners here in Allison's Corner. My name is Tia Mitchell. I am Washington correspondent for the Atlanta Journal Constitution. So I'm based in DC covering politics for usually a Georgia focused audience, but I also do a lot of TV and appearances on all types of places. So I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I really wanted to have this discussion with you because, as you know, we do have an important election coming up in the next month. And I think it's important for us to be informed as far as what both candidates bring to the table, what viewers might be interested in learning about, or excuse me, voters might be interested in learning more about, and just overall getting more expertise from you. So, are you ready, Tia?
I am ready.
Oh.
Just lay it on me.
All right, girl, here we go. So, the first question deals with election trends. So, what key trends are you noticing as we approach the 2024 US elections? And are there any surprising shifts in voter behavior?
So, I will say probably the biggest trend is the focus on abortion access and reproductive rights. Ever since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, it's become a big thing, particularly a theme that Democrats are pushing because they know it's an issue where they have a huge advantage over Republicans. Also, I think it's become a big theme in the presidential race once Vice President Harris became the Democratic nominee, because it is something that she had already really been speaking out about even before she was the nominee. So that's a trend. Of course, I would say on the Republican side, the issue they've been focusing more recently on is immigration, illegal immigration at the southern border, but just immigration in general, and really painting a picture of immigration having negative effects on cities and communities and resources and the economy, quite frankly, which um, isn't always based in the truth, but it does kind of feed into a fear that some people have about immigrants and how they're impacting communities and in the job market. So those are two trends that kind of aren't the usual suspects, I would say, in addition to like the more common things like the economy, inflation, and the cost of goods. You also asked about any changes when it comes to like voting patterns. And I think that, we'll see if there are any shifts when everything is said and done after Election Day. But I would say that Democrats in particular are very interested in younger voters and kind of millennials and Gen Z that are the newest voters,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to take advantage of that and ensure that the trend remains where usually younger voters vote for Democratic candidates. But that kind of became skewed a little bit when Joe Biden was the nominee, and a lot of young voters felt that he was too old and couldn't relate to him. So, they're looking at that pattern. I think the patterns that are interesting that we're seeing play out is the divide among the sexes, where men are much more likely to support Donald Trump, and that's across all races. Women are more likely to support Kamala Harris, that's across all races. And then education level as well. College educated people are much more likely to support Kamala Harris than non college educated people.
Hmm. And so I remember 2020, of course, the main issue in 2020 was the handling of COVID. That was the prevalent issue. So it's interesting now to see how the backdrop of COVID played a role in the election of 2020, and seeing now as we move here in 2024 how reproductive rights, immigration, the cost of living have really influenced how voters will vote in November. Do you think that any of the key issues that are pressing right now, do you feel as though that's still going to have an effect later on as we begin, like in January, with a new president?
Yeah, I mean, I think all these issues are going to have an effect. Even COVID, like as we come out of COVID, it's changed how we vote. Drop boxes became more prevalent under COVID. People more willing to vote by mail in ways that the trend pre-COVID was that Republicans voted by mail much more than
Oh,
Democrats, and
really?
Republicans yes, and
Oh.
Republicans saw that as an advantage. That's why so many states, particularly in the South, made it easier to vote by mail. It's because those states were controlled by Republicans, and
Hmm.
Republicans felt that that gave them an advantage. Well, Democrats started to pay attention and started to encourage voting by mail to catch up with the Republicans on that trend. And then during the pandemic, it became a way for people to vote and social distance and not be in long lines or inside in precincts. And unfortunately, Donald Trump began to tell people that he didn't trust voting by mail. And that, quite frankly, a lot of people feel that it fed into why he lost, is because he was telling his supporters not to trust methods of voting. And then that leaves more up to chance on election day. If you can't catch a ride, or work gets busy, or your child gets sick, or the lines are long. So, but I just, yeah, it was only seen as a Democratic advantage in very recent years. And now that's why you see Republicans in some of those same states now trying to limit voting by mail, or they wanted to limit the use of drop boxes. It's not it really comes down to what they think will help their team. Um, so we'll see how that plays out. But a lot of these issues aren't going away. And a lot of these issues will depend on who wins. Like, for example, abortion access. Kamala Harris has said if she wins and if Democrats get control in Congress, she would like to pass federal laws protecting access to abortion. A lot of Republicans say if they can get Donald Trump in the White House and Republicans can control Congress, they would like to pass a law creating federal limits to access to abortion. So, and of course, whoever wins the presidency will get to select new Supreme Court justices. A lot of people think that there could be up to two vacancies within the next 4 years. And that's completely up to the president with Senate confirmation. So if the White House and the Senate are the same party, they can pretty much put whoever they want into the Supreme Court if those positions become available. So that has a lot of ramifications for abortion access. The economy, both parties say they want to fix the economy, bring down inflation, address some of the pains that people are expressing when it comes to housing, childcare. Um, that is something that the government has more control on than say like the price of goods at the grocery store or the cost of gas that government doesn't have as much control over. Um, and there are very different visions for that,
Mhm.
depending on if you hear from Kamala Harris or hear from Donald Trump. So that will have an effect on the strategy moving forward in January when the new president is sworn in. So all of these things, even when you talk about public health and not just COVID, but just risks for future pandemics, access to healthcare. Democrats have talked about Medicaid expansion and how to force, quite frankly, states like Georgia that have resisted expanding Medicaid. The vast majority of states have expanded Medicaid in the years since the law was passed in 2012, but there are still holdouts, again, mostly Republican led states and mostly in the South. But would a Democratic president and be able to put in new incentives or new programs to help with healthcare access in those states that haven't expanded Medicaid. Whereas Donald Trump has talked about repealing or rolling back aspects of the 2012 Affordable Care Act.
Yeah. Thank you for breaking that down because a lot of that information I was unaware of. I didn't know that voting by mail was popular long before the pandemic because I myself
Mhm.
I do early voting, but I'll go in line and cast my vote. So
Yeah.
voting by mail or anything or doing absentee ballots was something that I was unfamiliar with just because I usually vote early anyway, but I can understand how having that accessibility, especially if you're older, if you are working
Yeah.
and you do have a family, all of those might play a role and it just might be easier for you to do it. So
Yeah.
definitely.
And there are systems in place. I voted by mail. I'm like you. I usually vote early in person.
Mhm.
I have for many years. I voted by mail for the first time in the primary here in Maryland where I live because I was going to be traveling, and Maryland only has like a week of early voting, and just to ensure that I was able to vote. And quite frankly, because I'm registered non I don't register with any political party. I'm just a no party affiliated person.
Mhm.
So my primary ballot is very limited. And so I was like, to make sure that I vote and I don't feel like standing in line to like have like two judicial races on my ballot. So I voted by mail for the first time, but a lot of states it make it easy, but for those me, I used to say, "Well, I don't wanna vote by mail because I wanna ensure my vote is counted, that's why I vote in person." Well, now you can actually check with your state to track your mail-in ballot, and it'll
Mm.
show you, has that ballot been mailed to you? And then once it's been mailed to you and once you receive it and you mail it back in, it'll show you, has that ballot been received? Most states have that tracking system so that you will know. And if for some reason on election day, it doesn't show that your mail in ballot was received, you can usually vote by provisional ballot. Or if you never turn in your mail in ballot for whatever reason, some states allow you to, again, you can use a drop box. I've done that in the past with your mail in ballot, leaving it at a drop box. Some states let you bring your mail in ballot to the precinct on election day. You just have to check in. Those types of things vary by state, but some people just like that flexibility.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. I agree. Thank you for that. That's definitely something people need to know. And of course, it varies by state, so making sure you know what works for your state. Thank you. We're going to go on to another question that deals with the impact of misinformation that has unfortunately been happening in this election cycle. How are candidates and voters responding to the ongoing issue of misinformation and disinformation in this election?
So, I would say not well. It's a struggle this election because there is so much misinformation online. There are AI generated images and videos that are not rooted in reality and give misleading pictures. Even around the hurricane recovery, we've seen a lot of misinformation that's been partisan. So, there's a lot of information being thrown at people that to consume in addition to just like the normal campaign ads that are like one-sided and misleading. And so I think it puts the onus on voters to really do their homework. And I know that's not always easy. Puts the onus on voters to really go with reputable news sources.
Mhm.
Your legacy media like your local newspaper, your major cable networks, your fact checking websites. I'm a huge supporter, a huge fan of PolitiFact, which does a lot of fact checking of elected officials and the things they say. I'm also a huge supporter of Snopes, which is a website that fact checks like viral information online, just viral memes or stories you might see on your Facebook feed that aren't necessarily political, but you're like, is that true? Did that really happen? Um, and so you just got to do your own homework. You got to, when you see something on a Facebook feed, check the source. And If you see a TikTok, that's another thing. People get on TikTok and they sound really official and they sound like they know what they're talking about and
Yeah.
they say they're explaining it to you, but do they cite sources? Do they, or are they just saying, "Well, this is what I know." Big example recently is Jaguar Wright. She sounds like she knows what she's talking about, but when you just dig a little bit deeper,
Was she there?
was she there? Is there any evidence? Does she back it up with any evidence other than just trust me? And that's not enough if that person A has proven themselves to be trustworthy. That's another thing I tell people. Once someone has shown you that they have gotten it wrong and they didn't correct themselves, they didn't cite their sources, and when their misinformation was pointed out, if they didn't take accountability and try to correct the record, then
Mhm,
you got to take them off your list as someone you trust and you listen to, because they've shown you that they don't deserve that trust. And so we've got to just be better consumers of the news. On your Facebook feed, hover over those posts. What is that URL? Is it CNN.com? Or is it like cnn.com.au.news? Because that ain't
mhm,
CNN's website. That's someone trying to look like CNN, So you just have to be really careful. Take a minute, like take 30 seconds and research something before you repost it or you share it. Take 30 seconds to kind of think critically about what you just saw in your algorithm on social media before you take it as gospel.
mm. Thank you, because I do think because of the advent of social media, while it is helpful in spreading awareness as far as the issues that voters are having or the ideas and the policies that candidates do have, I do think that it also can have a lot of misinformation. And I have seen a lot of misinformation myself. And I do have to be careful in saying, okay, is this person just doing this for views and clicks?
Mhm.
Or is this a reliable source that I definitely, believe to be true? And also, sometimes, we have to be careful about the news that we are also ingesting ourselves and also telling others to go and support. So I definitely agree. And of course, with AI, yes, that's a whole
Mhm.
different discussion. But yeah. Um, Now, with election security, what are the major challenges or improvements to election security since the 2020 elections? And is this improving voter confidence?
So there's a lot that has been done for election security. I can tell you, I covered Georgia, and as we know, Georgia was in the middle of the Stop the Steal efforts, and there was a lot, again, of sowing mistrust in Georgia's election system, but it's very secure. Um, but there's a lot of misinformation out there that unfortunately causes people not to have trust in their election systems. So, again, I think what people have to do is listen to their election officials and secretary of states,
Mhm,
and make sure you're consuming reputable news when people raise. I mean, there are always issues and things being raised, but is it in good faith, or is this someone trying to sow discord? We know former President Trump, tried to sow discord and distrust in the election system because he was trying to overturn the election results because he lost. And unfortunately, a lot of Republicans helped facilitate that. And even in Georgia, even as we had Republican leaders like Governor Kemp, Secretary of State Raffensperger, they said, no, our elections were secure. Donald Trump lost, but then they still supported or did not stand in the way of changes to the election laws that fed into the mistrust. It's like, why are you changing the laws if the laws were fine as they are?
mhm,
And they didn't have a good answer to that other than, oh, well, we just want people to trust. And it's like, okay, but why don't they trust? Oh, it's because Donald Trump has not been telling them the truth. So some of it is just people are distrustful right now because unfortunately Donald Trump and his allies are feeding them false information to sow distrust. But at the same time, I do think, again, going into this election season, election officials in every state have been very cognizant of that and been trying to put out information to help people understand how elections work, help people understand, for example, that it might take some time to count the votes. That doesn't mean that the election's not secure or not accurate. That just means it takes time
Yeah.
to count millions of ballots
Yeah.
and to make sure it's done accurately. And as you count ballots, different types of ballots, for example, the in-person day of voting gets posted pretty quickly. Early voting gets posted pretty quickly, but for some states, you can't start counting the mail in ballots until after all polls closed,
Mm.
which means it takes time to process that mail, quite frankly. And again, we know right now that mail in voting favors Democrats. So a Republican could be slightly ahead, but once mail in votes start being counted, they could lose that advantage. That does not mean the election was stolen. That just means that the votes that are being counted last, which is usually in a lot of states, that's mail in ballots. Um, those votes that counted last favor the Democratic candidate. Or, again, it used to be the other way
Yeah.
that Democrats had to do really well on election day because they knew that once absentee votes were counted, it would favor Republicans. So yeah, it's got to be both though. Our elected officials have to do everything they can to make sure people feel confident and that people understand the system. But it would help if some elected officials weren't willing to lie and sow distrust just because they didn't win.
Yeah, yeah. I definitely think the integrity of our elections are at stake, and being able to have a peaceful transfer of power is definitely something that's in the back of everyone's mind as we go into this election.
Hmm.
I do want to switch gears and go into pretty much the influence of third parties. As we know, the US is pretty much a two-party system with Republicans on one side, Democrats on the other. Do you foresee any significant influence from third-party candidates or independent voters in this election?
I think initially when it was Trump versus Biden, the third party candidates were playing a much bigger role. But now that one of the biggest potential third party spoiler candidates, RFK Jr., is mostly out of the race, even though he's trying to stay on the ballot
Mhm.
in certain states. But most states he's not on the ballot and he's just no longer an issue because he suspended his campaign. It was always going to be either the Republican or the Democrat would win. But it was a chance for a while that a third party candidate could be the spoiler in certain battleground states where the results were going to be really really close. I just think that's even less of a factor now. um, the way things are settling out, the third party candidates are polling so low, particularly in battleground states. To not be much of a factor. And we just seen some of those third party candidates just kind of fizzle out. Jill Stein, Cornell West, and again, RFK Jr. You're just not hearing much from them. It's not like it was the year that, Ross Perot really was able to serve as a spoiler. So I don't think this year, I don't think they're going to have much of an impact. Um, it's looking like voters at this point are making up their mind between Biden and Harris.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. How do you think the media's role in this election has evolved? And of course, we spoke a little bit about social media earlier. How do you think social media has changed those dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, I think media has an important role because we know that people still do look to the media for information, but the media landscape is so kind of siloed and segregated that media doesn't have the influence that it once had because media doesn't have the audience that it once had.
Mm,
And that's why you see the candidates not doing traditional media interviews as or they're adding other things into the mix. You know, the fact that Kamala Harris is doing things with Charlemagne the God and Call
Mhm.
Her Daddy podcast
Yeah,
and
yeah.
in non-traditional media, non-legacy media, because she's trying to reach audiences that don't necessarily consume traditional media. That being said, I think voters kind of default to traditional media when the stakes are high. So, you know, the hurricanes that have hit recently, you're not going to Call Her Daddy for hurricane information. You're going to legacy media, you're going to your local TV station, your local newspaper, or your national outlets like CNN, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, NBC. So, that's when the media knows there still are a lot of eyes, and it's the media's responsibility to be accurate,
Mhm,
to not let speed or wanting the scoop get in the way of being correct. um, the media also, we're focusing more on context and explaining a little bit more of how we do what we do, why we do what we do, to kind of ensure that we're doing our best to instill trust. But I do think there is a role in new media, social media, but that's why we hope folks who are on social media try to do it in good faith. Um, and again, we all make mistakes, but the question is, what happens when you've realized you've made a mistake? What happens when you realize that you weren't quite accurate? And that to me is the difference between someone who is trying to be a good faith communicator of news and someone who isn't. Um, Also, the other thing is there's partisanship now, and you
mhm,
can go to someone who only gives you news in a way that you wanna consume it or with the lens you wanna consume it. You know, it's the people who were mad at NABJ because NABJ invited Donald Trump because they feel like Black reporters should not want to hear from Donald Trump because of all the problematic and ugly things he said about Black people to black reporters or about Black spaces. But I disagree because at the end of the day, Donald Trump is a leading candidate for president. And at the time, he was the front runner. And even now that it's tied, he could be president. So we as journalists should hear from him and should ask him tough questions, even if it makes us uncomfortable at times. But there are kind of news outlets that are more like activism journalism or journalism with an agenda, and that's okay. I think there's a role for that, but I think consumers need to understand that certain outlets, if they have an agenda or have a clear point of view, may not be giving you the whole story. And so as you consume these kind of one-sided um one-sided kind of ways of delivering news, you have to think about what you're not hearing.
mhm,
And we kind of have had an example of that recently with Ta-Nehisi Coates and his new book. There's been a lot of controversy because he very deliberately said, my book is from this portion of my book is about the Israel Hamas conflict from the view of the Palestinian people. You
mhm.
know, he's been very transparent about that. He
Yeah,
said, you know, other people have written this about this conflict from the view of the state of Israel or from the view of Jewish people. I chose to really focus in on Palestinian people. And so he admits that it's one sided, it's by design. And some people are upset with him about that. I personally am not because I appreciate the fact that he's been very transparent about the fact that he chose to give his outlet a very specific view. And people who want to have a more comprehensive view, you've got to know for yourself his book is not going to do that for you.
right.
So you've got to go to other places. It's not on him to give you that other view because that's not what he set out to do. And he's been transparent about that. It's on us as consumers to understand and acknowledge his view is from a specific lens. He is not trying to give us the whole picture. So if you want a more comprehensive picture, you've got to get it from somewhere else.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. I agree. Now, social media and media companies have unfortunately been either left leaning or right leaning. And so it really is hard because, as somebody who just wants to be informed and to know where both candidates stand, you get one side more than you get the other, and it subconsciously makes you lean more towards one side than the other when you really just want a full picture of everything that's going on. So I agree with that. I myself am trying to pay more attention to it. So I'm not only leaning here or only leaning here. I'm trying to see the neutrality between them both. Um,
Mhm.
Now we were talking about younger voters, so I want to switch to that a little bit. What new or shifting voter demographics should we be paying attention to in this election cycle as it pertains to young and minority voters?
So I think that even within young voters and minority voters, there's so many different ways to look at that, and I think we have to remember intersectionality.
Mm,
So, age is just one way to separate people, and we know that, like, younger voters tend to be more progressive, vote more Democratic, older voters tend to be more conservative.
mhm,
But even among younger voters, we can separate that out. Again, those who are college educated, those who live in cities versus those who are more rural, voters of color versus white voters. So it still is interesting to me that, or important to me to think about the different ways we can even look within young voters. Sexual orientation,
mhm,
you know, gay, lesbian, trans, straight, religion, the influence of Christian conservatism um, on voters of all ages is something to be studied. And then again, we talked before about the gender divide, where young women vote differently than young men.
mhm,
So I find it all really interesting. There isn't always great polling about that intersectionality because the more you dig down on specific types of voters, the less reliable polling in because sample sizes become really small.
yeah,
But anecdotally, I found as a journalist that all of those things have nuance, Muslim voters, voters who are more sympathetic to the Palestinians within the Israel Hamas conflict have a very different outlook on the presidential election than your more kind of rank and file Democratic voters who don't think the Israel Hamas conflict is going to be as big of a deciding factor for them when it comes to who to vote for in November. So all of those things play a part. For minority voters, we've talked a lot. Black voters are the backbone of the Democratic Party. It's hard for any Democrat to win if they don't get an overwhelming number of the black vote. We're talking high 80s, low 90s.
mhm,
But black men, Donald Trump is really trying to do a lot of outreach to black men. And we've seen the polling show that Kamala Harris is not polling as strong with black men as other Democrats have done in the past. Now,
mm,
we don't know if that polling is going to shake out on election day, but it's definitely, we know, been a point of concern for Democrats that, again, in a state that's going to be close like Georgia, a little bit of fall off from black men could cost her the election.
mm, yeah. Yeah, I definitely have noticed that shift in behavior recently. And you spoke a lot about the Israel Hamas conflict. How are all of those things, so the war in the Middle East or potential war in the Middle East, how are things like inflation, energy crisis, supply chain disruptions, how is that influencing policy discussions here in the US?
So it's a lot. It's very complicated when we talk about the Israel Hamas conflict. And I am by far no expert. But one of the things that makes the Israel Hamas conflict complicated is that Israel is a long-standing ally and a powerful ally of the US. And that's not a tie that is easily broken.
Hmm.
And quite frankly, with our close allies, we tolerate a lot.
Yeah.
So, Israel and its ongoing conflict in the Middle East with uh, its neighboring nations with Iran, Lebanon, of course, Palestine, Gaza, and the West Bank being those Palestinian territories. Quite frankly, the ongoing conflict with Jewish people, Christians, and Muslims all trying to have control of historic religious sites in that area.
Mhm.
And it's very long-standing, very complicated, and it every time you say, "Well, this is how it started," you can go back even further. So even when we talk about October 7th being, of course, a brutal, terrible attack, all these innocent lives taken when Hamas um, attacked Israel, attacked a music festival, quite, and we have to think about that. It was a music festival. They didn't attack a military facility. They attacked just people at a music festival enjoying their day. So it was a
Mhm.
very brutal, deadly attack, very sad day. And it was one of the deadliest attacks on Israel. So everything that has come since has been justified as like Israel rightly retaliating after a brutal attack. But we have to also acknowledge that October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum,
Mhm.
and that Hamas felt that it, on October 7th, was retaliating for other attacks on its people and its territories. And since October 7th, Israel's retaliation has not just been against Hamas as a governing body and a military entity. There have been lots, tens of thousands of Palestinians who have lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands, if not more, Palestinians have lost their homes and become refugees. So
Yeah.
it's very complicated. And at the end of the day, the US doesn't get to decide how Israel conducts itself. It can do all the cajoling and diplomacy and bilateral talks and phone calls and messaging, but they don't control Israel. And so they can do is try their best to kind of like get Israel to handle it the way that they think would be best, and Israel can listen or not. Same with Hamas. US can't just say, Hamas, let's do a ceasefire. Let's stop the bombing. Let's stop the back and forth. If it was that easy, it would have been done.
Yeah.
So the US ends up taking a backseat role, but the US still has these ties. So the US, I won't even say a backseat role because that's probably diminishing it. But the US at the end of the day can't make a decision on when the bombing stops. But the US does make decisions on how it spends its money with its ally, Israel. It is still sending weapons to Israel. A lot of
Mhm.
people aren't happy with that, would like the US to stop sending weapons because we know those weapons are being used to bomb and attack Palestine or Gaza. But again, it's not that easy because this is a long-standing ally. The U.S. has also sent a lot of money for humanitarian aid to Gaza, so U.S. is paying for the invasion in some ways, but then paying to help the people after they're invaded. It's really
Yeah.
complicated, really sticky. It's not easily. That's why Harris and President Biden, Vice President Harris have said the thing they want is a ceasefire because nothing else is really within their purview, to be honest. Um, Eventually, could there be enough public pressure to stop the weapons from going to Israel? Perhaps. I don't think it's come to that yet. There's still a lot of support in Congress. There's still a lot of support, quite frankly, among the donor class in both parties for Israel.
Mhm.
And so I don't think that the powers that be in the federal government are willing to go there to stop the weapons from flowing to Israel right now.
Mm. Yeah. And thank you again. Didn't Thank you for the information because I myself am not an expert. Just from what the little bit that I know. So I appreciate you breaking it down so that we'll be able to have a better view and understanding of it. I want to talk a little bit about climate change. How do you see climate change and international environmental agreements shaping the political landscape? And are they becoming more prominent issues in global politics?
So, climate change, I mean, look at these huge storms, huge devastating storms. The fact that Western North Carolina, which is far from the coast, was devastated
Yeah.
by a hurricane. So we can't diminish the impact of storms and climate change. However, it is partisan. There's a partisan divide there, like with so many things. And we know Republicans are less willing to talk about climate change and talk about human impacts on weather patterns.
Mhm.
So that's why, again, it's another reason why elections matter, because if you think that climate change is real and you want government to do what it can to stem the effects of climate change, then you'd probably be better off supporting a Democrat, because Republicans are, and Donald Trump, quite frankly, has questioned the impact of climate change and and hasn't shown that he's willing to really address that head on. He's criticized some of the things that Biden did during his term to, support clean energy, support electric vehicles, ways that are intended to, again, to think about reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. Um, so it is a through line in our politics. And quite frankly, it's also just a through line in, like, just the day to day. We're seeing devastation. It's costing us as taxpayers. We're talking out billions of dollars that are going to have to be spent on recovery efforts in parts of Florida, where we already spent billions of dollars on recovery efforts after the last hurricane.
Yeah.
Florida property insurance is astronomical in Florida, partially because of the impact of repeated natural disasters in the state. While, Governor DeSantis in the Republican led legislature in Florida has done very little to address the concerns. Um, so it's elections matter. And again, if you disagree that climate change is real and you don't think that humans really have an effect on these major national disasters and global warming and the warming of the oceans, then maybe you do want to support Republicans who agree and are less likely to do things like um incentivize electric vehicles.
Mm. Yeah. It's interesting, especially because this past week with Hurricane Milton and seeing the devastation that that caused, and then previously with Hurricane Helene, and just seeing all of that, it's interesting to see the information that's coming from that and how right now what's taking shape as we move into the election. My last question for you, it has to deal with that of AI, and I know we again spoke about it previously, but with AI, cybersecurity, and just technology evolving overall, excuse me, what role do you think technology will play in shaping future world events and election outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI is here to stay for better or for worse. I actually have a good friend of mine who's a really popular AI artist.
Hmm,
So she creates digital portraits and pictures using solely AI, and she's going viral all the time. So it's been interesting to see it from that perspective. Of course, we know students are using AI for classwork. AI is using the internet to um, respond to prompts. So journalists like me are feeding the AI machine whether we like it or not.
right.
So I think that Congress really needs to get its head out of the sand and work on regulating AI. They've talked about it. They really haven't done much. Um, and so they're falling behind. And I think members know that. They're just hesitant to get in the fray. AI companies are spending a lot of money on lobbying, quite frankly. And there are a lot of competing interests with different platforms, different companies. And so it's just hard to do. And Congress doesn't always like to tackle the hard thing until, like, their back is against the wall and they have no choice. I think for regular folks, consumers, it's on us to really be careful about how we use AI. For example, now every time you Google or look up something, there's like an AI summary at the top before you even scroll.
Mhm.
And I personally, I might just be like the old person in me. I hate those AI summaries. They're never helpful to me. I'm like, that's not answering my question. So I still scroll past the AI summary, go to some, again, go to some primary sources. So you have the AI summary, but scroll past to the actual websites that AI summaries are pulled from.
Yeah,
Read more than just like the highlighted point that AI has decided is the passage that answers your question. Read the whole thing, start from the beginning, because usually the most important stuff is like at the beginning of a web page or an article. Um, so sometimes we have to go past what AI is feeding us to make sure that we're getting full context and make sure that the answer it's giving us is an accurate answer. Because again, AI is pulling from things, but they are not human. So sometimes they pull from things and give us an answer that isn't always the truth or rooted in reality, or it's missing context, or it's misleading, or it has a racial bias or a gender bias. And so we still have to do research on our own. Um, and also be careful about how we use AI. You know, I hear about people saying, well, I use Chat GPT to like help me send emails, or using Chat GPT to help kind of give you the right words to say or come up with a recipes. And it's
mhm,
like, you can use it for good, but you still have to do your due diligence. So, you know, when AI gives you that recipe, make it for yourself to make sure that recipe actually works the way it's supposed to work, and you don't have to, you know, put your own little spin on it. When you use AI to write an email, read what it sent you and make sure it makes sense before you cut and paste it into a body of an email. And, you know, I would caution students that like AI can be a helpful tool, but if it's becoming a crutch, then that's not good either. And quite frankly, your instructors are finding ways to get around that. So, you know, it can be, I think there are ways to use it for good, but I think it's on us to make sure that we are not letting it give us information that's not trustworthy. And again, I do hope that Congress eventually does something to better regulate AI, so that bad actors don't take advantage of it being right now, quite frankly, a wild, wild west.
yeah, I agree. Thank you so much, Tia. Those are all the questions that I had. Can you please let the people know where they can find you if they want to contact you for more information?
Yeah, my name's Tia Mitchell. I am on X, mostly just like sharing my work. My X account is at AJC on Washington. I'm also on Facebook. My page is facebook.com/, Tia Reports with an S on the end. But yeah, feel free to reach out, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you. And for everyone else listening, God bless. Have an amazing day. And thank you for listening to Allison's Corner.